Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Power After Carbon, Building a Clean, Resilient Grid. The title for today's webinar is taken from a book that was just released this week by Dr. Peter Fox-Penner, who we are delighted to have with us here today. Dr. Fox-Penner is founder and director of the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy and professor of practice at the Questrom School of Business, where he teaches courses on sustainable energy and electric power. After a short presentation, we're going to have the opportunity for some Q&A. So please submit questions through the chat feature, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And with that, I'll introduce our moderator, Lawrence Jones, EEI Vice President for International Programs, to provide some opening remarks and then introduce Peter. Lawrence?
Thank you, Daniel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. It's really a pleasure to welcome Peter to this webinar, our global webinar series here at EEI. I've known Peter for many years. I must say that his first book, Smart Power, was a bestseller. It came at a time when the industry was really dealing with this topic, smart grid, as many of you may remember. But I think Smart Power was a transcending book in the sense that Peter laid the foundation and addressed a whole range of issues around where the industry was at the time. Now, being the global thought leader that he is, everyone has been waiting for the next edition of Smart Power, and Peter came out and have surprised us by perhaps pushing the needle with the new book, which is called Power After Carbon, Building a Clean, Resilient Grid. I've read the book over the last couple of days. It came out, like Daniel said, a few days ago. And I must say, Peter, you've done an excellent job in laying the framework. And what is more timely about your book is that it comes at a time when the world is going through a major crisis, but that crisis is going to create all kinds of challenges, but also opportunities in terms of where do we go in terms of rethinking the future of electricity, rethinking the future of energy. And so we're glad to have you do this. This is perhaps your first webinar, Peter, I guess, or your first public appearance since the book was released this week. So we are very honored to be the ones having this opportunity to really get your insights on where the world is going as it relates to where we are today, but most specifically, the book. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Peter. Look forward to your presentation to set the scene in the book, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Over to you.
Thanks, Lawrence. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody from Little Compton, Rhode Island, where I'm sheltering in place. I hope you are all safe. Hats off to the frontline workers all around the world who are keeping us safe, and thanks to them. Thanks to Lawrence, who is not only the head of international programs at EEI, but also my fellow senior colleague at the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. So we really enjoy that collaboration, Lawrence, and look forward to more of it. But even more extensively than that, on behalf of Energy Impact Partners, where I'm privileged to serve as Chief Strategy Officer, I'd like to thank Lawrence for allowing EEI to let us appear. Many EEI members are also our partners at Energy Impact Partners. We've enjoyed very good relations with the Institute for Electrification and Innovation there. And we look forward to continuing to work with EEI and all of its members, not only in the US, but in Europe, where we have expanded operations now, and Asia, and even Africa, I think, where you and I talk quite a bit, Lawrence.
Exactly.
If it's all right with you, Lawrence, may I begin the presentation by sharing the screen, do a quick overview of the book?
Please do that, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
All right, fantastic. Well, if you folks can give me a moment to share the screen, get my screen up. Okie dokie.
While you get the screen up, Peter, I'm just going to say to the audience that this morning, picking up a cup of tea, I coincidentally picked up the tea that had the inscription on it. The Key to Happiness is a Good Book. And believe it or not, I noticed it when I sat down to start drinking my cup of tea. And so cheers to you, Peter, and go ahead and let's
thank you.
Get the show rolling.
Thank you. Daniel, do you have to give me permission? Because it's not coming up. Who can share?
I think you should be able to, but I'll see if there's anything that Maybe needs to be done. Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okie dokie. Then let's go. We all understand that we are in the middle of a long-run pandemic of climate change. The Earth has warmed already 1.1 degrees centigrade thanks to our greenhouse gas emissions. All of us, sea ice is declining, and global CO2 emissions continue to go up. They fell last year in the US a little bit, but they're not nearly enough. The one positive sign in all this, and it's very important, and one of the main motivations why I focused Power After Carbon on the decarbonization imperative, is that the power industry has, first of all, decreased its carbon emissions. You can see 29% here in the US, at least as much in Europe. And that the power industry is not only decreasing its emissions, but it is emerging as the absolute core of the climate solution. In the developed world, broadly speaking, the solution to climate change, I think we are all starting to agree, contains 5 or 6 elements, 4 of which are the focus of smart power, Power After Carbon, also smart power. You can see on the screen, first of all, energy efficiency is the first fuel. It's absolutely critical. We are tapping quite a lot of energy efficiency potential, but not nearly the amount that the experts, who I agree with, say is out there in developed economies. And energy use has been flat in the United States for 10 years. A lot of that has been attributable to energy efficiency driven not only by the market and market prices, which have been pretty stable, but also by better technologies and utility programs and lots of other energy efficiency measures, also true in Europe and most other developed economies. We're not doing as much of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's the first pillar of the climate strategy. The next 3 have directly to do with the decarbonized industry. First of all, I'm sorry. We need to decarbonize building heat. We need to electrify most transportation, and we need to electrify as many industrial processes as we can. And we could easily spend our whole discussion talking about any one of these verticals. There is incredible, extremely exciting work happening in electric transportation now. There's also quite a lot of work going on in the electrification of building heat, great work on heat pumps, and other interesting techniques, energy storage in buildings, the shells, as well as add-on equipment. And the latest frontier is industrial electrification, where there is lots and lots of work to do, but more and more recognition of the importance and interest. To do all of this, the keystone will be a large enough electric power system to power all of this new electrified load, and of course, including the existing load, without carbon, with high resilience to climate derived storms and other resilience threats. And of course, it has to be affordable and it has to be financeable. The industry has to be able to, and each element in the industry has to be able to be financially viable. One of the real important themes of the book is that, well, 2 important themes. One is that the electric power grid, as we all know, is an interdependent system. So you can't simply specify climate solutions as we need more solar, or we need more wind, or we need more storage. Because if it isn't integrated into the system in the right amount or proportion, the system doesn't work. So you have to think in system terms technologically. And that's very extensive need, and it's very interdependent and complex need. But the second point is that someone owns and operates every part of the system. And there are hundreds of thousands of owners of what we would call the technological electric power system, not even counting customers, the 120 million customers. And someone owns every piece of that. And they're all commercial entities that have to remain financially viable or morph into some form that does. And the imperative of decarbonizing in a way that's technologically resilient and affordable, but also financially viable, is really what makes the electricity dimension of the climate solution uniquely complex and uniquely interesting, and was really the motivation for writing the book. Let's see if I can get this to advance. So the first question the book tries to take on is, how much power are we really going to need when we do the energy efficiency that we can? And this is a very simplified, stylized diagram. On the left-hand side, you can see that electricity demand is denominated in the multiples of our current use, which is about 3,900 terawatt hours here in the US. And we all know GDP growth and population growth are the traditional drivers of electricity demand. We have managed to decouple from them quite a bit, as I mentioned earlier, drivers, and States is going to add another 40% population between now and 2050. I don't know what the number for Europe. Population in Africa will go up by several billion between now and 2050. So population growth is still a significant driver, and GDP growth a questionable driver, but usually positive. What energy efficiency does, as you see in the middle bar, is it offsets GDP and population growth. And in the US, as the bar shows, it's just about done that evenly, and same for Europe, by the way. So that we're sort of back to zero. But our energy efficiency policies in most places, and certainly here in the US as a whole, are nowhere near tapping the potential. And if we were to tap that potential, we could take energy use down, even electricity use down, with the current end uses. When you add in the new uses of electricity for transportation, building heat, and industrial electrification, you will bring electricity use back up unless, according to all the research that's documented in the book, you have extremely strong energy efficiency policies that tap pretty much all the potential or a vast percentage of it. And I personally expressed the opinion in the book that we're not going to have efficiency policies that strong. And as a result, electrification, if it happens as strongly and as quickly as it must to represent a climate solution for the world, it will take electricity demand back up. And as you can say, I think it's going to go up somewhere in the 1.5 to 2x range by 2050. And the wild card on that, to a degree, is the role of AI and edge computing and the tremendous next generation of communications and computing technologies, from quantum computing to AI. I don't have anywhere near a good enough crystal ball to know how significant that will be, but from what I can tell, you can read about it in the book, it's likely to be a net contributor, but it could, I think there's a scenario where it could add to energy demand a little bit, as we saw with blockchain. In general, though, this is where I think we're going to come out, somewhere in this range. I hope it's lower, but most importantly, we need to get to zero carbon quickly. Here's a little more about that. Electricity, this is the same vertical axis here, electricity sales in 2050 as a multiple of today's use. One would be same use as today in 2050, and this is a variety of deep decarbonization studies that are mostly vintage 2018, even a few 2019, because the book had to lock about this time last year. And you can see here, contrary to what I'm saying, most of these deep decarbonization studies kind of cluster around one, that in 2050 electricity use will be about what we're using today, maybe a little bit more, but most below 1.5, which is sort of around where I come in. Except for the United Kingdom, which has, in its deep decarbonization study, very strong push on electrification of all sectors, including industry, and relatively weak emphasis on energy efficiency. So you can see how those bars in the prior slide trade off in different countries and different studies. But in general, my comment on these studies is they assume very strong energy efficiency policies and very weak electrification relative to what I assume. And they mostly are 80 by 50 studies. They're not complete decarbonization studies. I believe that the power grid needs to get to and can get to almost complete decarbonization. So I push the envelope a little harder. I think that pushes the numbers up from these. But any of you who are familiar with more recent deep decarbonization studies, please send them to me. I'd like to update this to make it current now that the book is over and we're into kind of the next generation. So how much of this electricity are we going to get from local sources? This is one of the obsessions that led to the book. You know, some folks are really have the view or imply that we're not going to really need a large power grid because we're going to localize our power production. And I think that it is both the case that we will continue to get more power locally, and that in most parts of the world, local or distributed supply will increase in amount, and it will increase in importance and complexity. But I think that in almost all parts of the world, looking at the total electricity needs we just talked about, we're going to need a significantly larger grid. In some cases, it's not going to be massively larger in some areas, but we're going to need to expand the big grid. And some of these numbers, I think, speak to that. This is the percentage of power available from rooftops. You can see 0 to 100, and it's from NREL data that many of you are very familiar with. Fantastic work done by many folks at NREL. They've been great colleagues of mine for years. And as we reported in our work for Carbon Free Boston, from that data, you can get only about 15% of Boston's current electricity use from rooftops, using all available rooftops, using that LiDAR mapping methods and looking at roof geometries and all of those important things. Miami, about 46%, Germany, 35%. Now, with the exception of Boston, which, as all of you know, is a wonderful city with not a lot of roof space, those are very significant amounts, but they're nowhere near what we're going to need. And this is the percentage of current needs. Those cities, which are very energy dense, are going to need more electricity delivered to them from a large grid. Now, that doesn't mean that the grid will deliver from a continent away, although there is some possibility of that, but we need some sort of bulk grid infrastructure and market structure that's going to deliver Germany and Miami and Boston the power they need. I've saved the first bar on the left to last because one of the things I did in the book is look for a city that could supply all of its own power, in theory, from rooftops. I decided to do a deep dive on Phoenix. You can read about it in almost a whole chapter of the book. And Phoenix is a sprawling city with lots of rooftops, relatively low density of energy use. And you can see that rooftop potential is 80% just from the rooftops. And if you cover just a little bit of the uncovered parking surfaces with solar canopies, you can get to 108% of energy demand. But of course, that's sun shining in the day. That's just the aggregate terawatt hour usage of the city. And you'll have to have storage, a heck of a lot of it. And just as a thought experiment, I asked my team to calculate the amount of land that Phoenix would need to store the energy, and it worked out to 23% of the land area of Phoenix. Now, of course, this is just a thought experiment, but it does illustrate that rooftop solar potential and potential from building skins, you can read about that in the book too, is significant, but it's not going to get us all the way there. So how do we build a bigger grid that's fully decarbonized? There's a whole section of the book about this, and just to summarize it in one brief slide, I think there are 4 big imperatives, and those of you who are working in this area are going to look at this and say, oh, these are very, very well recognized. I don't believe that the book is breaking any new ground by saying this, but I have tried to collect the reason why these are important and the discussion around these imperatives and how to move forward on them in one place in a user-friendly way that's understandable not only by you and me and our colleagues, but by policymakers and regulators and other important stakeholders that we need to bring along on this decarbonization journey. So just mentioning them briefly, many people don't understand that we need terawatt scale seasonal storage to balance the grid. We're nowhere near achieving the amount of that we're going to need. There is good recognition of this in the industry, and we're starting to see large scale storage procurements, a gigawatt hour scale procurement coming out of California, and other projects around the world, several large pump storage projects in Chile, and lots of good R&D from folks like Form Energy in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on new forms of seasonal chemical storage. Hydrogen's likely to play or could play a really important role here. Very interesting project starting up in Utah, storing hydrogen in a cavern, much like compressed air is stored. So we need a lot of work here. Lithium-ion batteries are fantastic. They're going to continue to get cheaper. They're great behind the meter. They're great in cars, but I don't think they're the solution in total. So flexible load, sometimes known as demand response. The potential is enormous. Back of the envelope, my colleagues at Energy Impact Partners think there's 200 gigawatts, as much as 200 gigawatts of that in the United States alone. That's a fifth of our current grid. That's monumental. That's as large as the remaining coal capacity and going to be soon larger. So this is a very significant resource, but it's also a challenging resource. It's not a single large system you can control with an AGS system by pulsing it every 5 seconds from one control room. This is spread out over thousands or even millions of customers who are shifting their own patterns of use and so on. So this is really a question of market, regulatory, or what we economists like to call institutional design and advancements. And the work is ongoing. I see it advance every year, but it's still moving slowly. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Transmission. It is underplanned and underbuilt in the United States. I'm sorry to be so simple and blunt, but you can read more about it in the book. Europe is doing a better job of planning it. China's doing a better job of planning it, but even there, you folks have challenges that even you acknowledge. You can read about them also in the book. So let me just leave it there in the interest of time. But this is very important because we don't necessarily need a coast-to-coast DC supergrid. It would be nice to have one, but I don't think that's essential. There's discussion of it in the book, but I do believe we will need more interregional transmission than we have. That's acknowledged in all of the planning studies, and let's just leave it there. And finally, of course, markets, bulk power markets. We are in the process of reforming them and debating reform all over the world. There are several dimensions of this, starting, I think, in all cases with disaggregating the traditional energy and capacity products into a more variegated set of services, and then figuring out how to marketize them. Lots of interesting innovations, from the reactive power market in South Wales to new products in California and other parts of Europe. China's doing some interesting work here. But it's complex and it's slow, and it needs to get done. So those are some of the challenges on the big grid. Just for fun, I wanted to show you very briefly, some work that we did at Boston University with a group in China called the Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization. It's a trade group, and it has a vision for interconnecting the entire world with a DC supergrid. There's their sort of conceptual diagram. You can see more about it in the book. It's a really path-breaking idea, but I don't think we'll necessarily get to this. I do think DC transmission's increasing all over the world in segments, but I just thought for fun I would show you this. Talking about the distribution system finally, the distribution part of the industry is the third segment. It's a segment we all understand that takes the power and distributes it to millions of customers and factories and buildings. Most people, especially outside the industry, don't understand how variegated this portion of the industry is. There's more than 3,000 distribution utilities in the US. Here's the map. Different parts of Europe have vastly different numbers. There are, I think, 400 in Germany, only 16, I believe, in the UK, 2 in China. So you have vastly different scales and organizations of distribution utilities. You also have different ownership patterns, many publicly owned, many investor owned, and many cooperatives. So you start with a geographically balkanized set of very, very important players who themselves have different underlying business and financial organizations. Whatever their organization, whatever their geographic size, they face a number of business pressures, and all of you in the business will recognize these. In the short run, we have low to negative kilowatt hour sales, which put pressures on revenue. Every distribution utility is facing increases in CapEx demands. They have an aging plant in most developed parts of the world. The distribution system is well past its safe use by date for many parts of the system. And in addition, we're having to make very important investments in cybersecurity. Energy Impact Partners has a number of really interesting cybersecurity investments, and utilities are finding that's absolutely critical. Also, to make the grid smarter, more visible, and marketizable on the distribution system level, we need several new layers of software systems like Opus One that give visibility onto feeders, allow hosting capacity for systems to go up. So there's a lot of CapEx demands. At the same time, we've got revenue pressures. And by the way, COVID, of course, which is lowering sales by in the realm of 8%, last I looked, is adding significantly to these pressures. Then we have a much more complex and operating environment. Customers have become accustomed to 24/7 reliability in all their services. Electricity is very reliable in almost all parts of the developed world, but climate change and the increasingly severe storms are moving that trends backwards. Also accommodating DG and DR creates new operating imperatives. And finally, there is a significant risk of I think, political as well as technological fragmentation of the distribution part of the industry, and I think a little bit of risk of customer defection. So to match that or respond to that, there's several dimensions of strategies that distribution utilities are adopting. I tend to put them on this Cartesian diagram because I was trained as an engineer, and we did a lot of these diagrams, not as a 2x2 matrix McKinsey consultant, but the dimensions of business strategy, the way I tend to look at it, are along the bottom, the regulated grid business model or ownership model for, in the case of a municipal utility or a co-op, or a government-owned utility. They all, the business models in their distribution system role is one dimension of this. The other dimension, going up at 45-degree angle, is adding competitive services, not necessarily regulated services, through affiliates. Some would call that diversification, and in particular diversification outside the regulated footprint into new products. There's quite a lot of that going on. And then the final dimension that every utility has to decide on is its geographic span of operation. And of course, we have everything from very strictly local, city-focused utilities to all the way to global operations like NL that operate in 51 countries. So those are the main dimensions, and we have lots of examples of this everywhere in that three-dimensional space. But focusing lastly just on the regulated business model spectrum, those of you who are familiar with any of my conversations or many business model conversations and utility of the future conversations all over the world, and of course the original discussion in Smart Power, know that I posited two main business models in the future called the Smart Integrator and the Energy Service Utility. The Smart Integrator is basically a platform utility that allows the market to sell through, if you will, services to end users of all types. And then the Energy Service Utility is a more integrated, regulated utility that partners more intensively and offers more integrated service packages to its customers. Those are the middle yellow and blue models I've seen now and we are seeing increasingly hybrids that blend those two. And I think that is likely to be the way of the future. There's also some talk of passive distribution utilities that are just pure owners and the system's operated by a purely independent DSO. I don't personally favor that, and I think it doesn't have lots of momentum, but it's possible. And then finally, at the right-hand side, some folks, I think, will exit the distribution system business because of all the challenges we've talked about. So let me just close by saying, reminding everybody that electrification is really an essential frontier, and there are some great groups working on this. There's a few logos, including the Alliance for Transport Electrification, which I was proud to help start, but I enjoy working with many of these groups, and I thank them for their efforts. In the interest of time, there's a summary in the slide deck, which will be produced to everybody, but I think I will just summarize by saying that I think a fully decarbonized grid is very achievable. I think we can beat the year 2050. We need to maximize energy efficiency, really engage in lots of regulatory innovation at the distribution level, do the big grid decarbonization imperatives that I talked about on the slide, and get going. So with that, let me just say thank you to all of you. There's the link to the book, some really important acknowledgements to some colleagues. And once again, thank you to all of you for taking some of your precious screen time to tune in here. And I'll turn it back to Lawrence and look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. We're gonna remove the sharing of your.
Yeah, I'm trying to stop sharing here. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for a very good summary of a book that normally would take several days to read, more or less. Let's get into the book and starting with a couple of questions. You've already mentioned, Peter, why you wrote the book, and you laid that framework down very well. And so, as you look back and in putting the book together, given where we are today, because I want to put the book in a proper context and putting the book way in the context of where the world is today. Can you reflect a little bit on what you would have done differently in terms of the content, and given the situation we are in today, how would you position the book as a go-to medium for understanding how we navigate our way to a better future, just given where we are today? How can this book be a tool that will allow us to do that sort of a transition?
Right. Well, I was constantly obsessed and worried about the fact that the book would be out of date before it actually showed up in print. I talked about the 1 year cycle between when you turn it in and when it shows up, and in a industry in which every one of us gets up and is pretty routinely amazed by the next day's email. Mm-hmm. Storage costs have dropped again. There's a new low bid for solar or wind somewhere in the world that no one ever thought possible. Electric vehicle sales are skyrocketing. This is great news, but terrible for an author who has to turn a book in. So I really tried to skate to where the puck is going and create something that would have some reasonable shelf life. For that reason, it's dangerous to make any prediction or put any number in the book, and I put a lot of them in there. But in general, most of the trend lines in the book have held up. And I could probably spend way too long talking about this, but let me tell you one or two that I didn't spot that I have noticed since. One of the ones is that solar seems to be gaining on wind, large-scale solar gaining on large-scale wind, mm-hmm. which I didn't expect. I fully expected community solar and medium-scale solar to continue to decrease in price. I also saw, when I was writing it, offshore wind was going through a big renaissance here in the U.S. And I just thought that the proportion of wind and solar added wouldn't change dramatically. There's a new forecast by Wood Mackenzie, I think out yesterday or the day before. That forecast's actually a tilt. So I don't talk about that in the book. And there's any number of other things that all of you in the audience are going to be emailing me for the next year, or hopefully several, saying, Peter, you got it wrong. And please do. I certainly welcome that. It happened in Smart Power, and it's what you sign up for when you write a book, folks.
Well, thanks. I think, we're getting a lot of questions in as it relates to the whole issue of the grid. And one specific question here is one that ties into Africa. And the question basically is, do you think with the expected 2 billion people in Africa, a big grid, as you describe it, is going to be needed? And if so, what would you recommend to African governments and the world at large to make sure that the big grid in Africa is developed in a way that is sustainable and financially viable?
Yeah, great question. As Lawrence knows, since he was the moderator for our presentation, my Institute for Sustainable Energy at Boston University just released a very extensive 100 and some page, very, very current review of Africa electrification studies. Focused, it's almost a mirror image of Power After Carbon. It was focused overwhelmingly on the question of, given Africa's tremendous needs for power, and in Africa, we're talking about something like a 4-fold increase in electricity demand by 2050. How much of that will we be able to get from distributed microgrids, and how much should we attempt to build out a large-scale grid? And our conclusion was that, of course, you need to do both. But the answer was strikingly similar to the answer in the developed world, in the sense that it looks like we can get a huge proportion, but not all, of the electricity that we will need from microgrids and small scale, perhaps 30 or 40% of this 4x. But that means we do need to build out the grids. How do you do that? Basically, if I could do anything in African countries, strengthen the regulatory institutions, the national regulatory institutions that create the framework for building utilities using, really, to be a bit parochial, the American invention of a market-financed but well-regulated utility. Because if you do that, you will open Africa to billions, even trillions of dollars of capital that I believe is ready to come into Africa. Mm-hmm. It just needs a stable governance framework. And if, as soon as individual nations do that, you can build interregional transmission much easier and move to regional planning. But I believe it starts at the nation.
Good. So here's a question, Peter, that sort of puts us into the future. It's 2050, and the question here is basically saying the system did not change or did not change fast enough within the year 2050. And the question is, what went wrong? Do you think it would be because of political barriers, economic barriers? Why didn't we get where we were supposed to get to based on your speculation or your prediction in the book? And we're now in the year 2050. So take us to 2050 and look back, and assuming we didn't get where you think we would get, why would that be the situation?
Oh, well, as a graduate of the University of Chicago, politics and economics are very tightly linked. I call myself a political economist, really, rather than anything else. If we don't get to where we go, I believe it's 90-10 that it's political economy, and only 10% that we don't have the answers, either technologically or even institutionally. John Holdren, who many of you recall was President Obama's science advisor for pretty much the whole term, has a great little saying. He says, everybody's always worried about climate change models and whether they're accurately predicted. By far, the largest variable in climate change models is how we humans behave in response to the results of these models that are showing us that we must decarbonize. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the reasons I wrote the book is to try and point the political economy towards the solutions and reassure people that while we don't have all the technological answers now, Ernie Moniz would shoot me if I said that, we have enough of them that we can start down the road faster than we're going, move faster than we're going, and we can beat 2050, I believe. Mm-hmm. So we need institutional and regulatory reform and new policies, policies like even things like stronger, faster building standards. And people don't like to talk about government standards sometimes, but standards are amazingly powerful for moving a market.
So let's get into the other topic of the book, which is around business models. And you talk about the fault lines beyond the industry. And you talk also about the situation around regulation, as you have mentioned already. I tend to see electricity in the context using the analogy of electrons are politically agnostic. Electrons tend to flow to the path of least resistance. They also tend to flow to the path where there is least political resistance, least regulatory resistance, but also the value being delivered should also be delivered where there is least resistance. How do we eliminate these resistance, if you may, that will inhibit the ability for electricity to flow in a way that is affordable and reliable? What kinds of new frameworks should we consider to be able to remove the resistance that will allow more electrons to flow in those three areas?
Well, that's a couple of days worth of discussions, I think, but just to tick off a few innovations that I think are essential. Up in the bulk power sector, as I said, decomposing or deconstituting the current bulk power products into more varied products is very important. We need, I call for much stronger regional energy planning. In the United States in particular, Europe already does it. It has the 10-year transmission planning process that's now, I think, in its third or fourth cycle. It's Europe-wide. It's very impressive, and it produces a 10-year plan that's, I think, the best regional plan out there. In the US, we're far behind, and we need a new regional planning set of institutions that's multi-fuel, not just electricity, but produces transmission and also industrial decarbonization plans that are stronger. I also think we need much more performance-based regulation at the state level. We're seeing lots of movement on that. It just needs to continue. And those are some of the big ones, Lawrence.
Yeah. So Peter, I think one thing I would infer from your first answer regarding the planning is more long-term thinking, right? And bringing within the long-term thinking, perhaps more sort of a stability and certainty around the investments, right? Because these are long-life assets, so you need to think long-term when you're putting it in place. We've seen in many parts of the world where regulators or policymakers sort of keep intervening back and forth, and that creates some uncertainty with regards to attracting investments. And so you dedicate chapter 14 in the book to, so you call it Money Talks, which I do like, and you talk about the role that Wall Street and new business models. Can you talk a little bit about that for those who haven't read the book? In essence, what are you trying to get across in terms of these new business models and how it links to Wall Street, or not just Wall Street, but any street, be it in Brussels or in South Africa? How do you get capital to sort of be part of this mix? And what are you hearing from the work you're doing?
Well, that's thanks for reminding me about that. I should have mentioned it earlier. First of all, when I'll say Lawrence uses the term Wall Street, we mean the global financial community.
Yes.
Which is, only a little on Wall Street. Although I'm proud to be part of Energy Impact Partners, which is based in New York, and we're still the financial capital of the world, in my view. But there's a very interesting duality going on, I think, in global financial markets. On the one hand, as we see every day in our work in Energy Impact Partners, which is a global financial clean energy investment vehicle, there is billions and billions of dollars, including more than $1 billion of our dollars, going into clean energy investment, and more committed to investing in decarbonization solutions from large scale to small scale. At Energy Impact Partners, we invest in primarily in growth equity, but in a larger and larger set of asset classes as we see the opportunities expand. Many of our colleagues in the impact investment community, including many of our LP investors, like the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway, are also prepared and really committed to moving towards financing the clean energy future. On the other hand, to my surprise, and you can read about this in the chapter in the book, when I talked to a lot of Wall Street financial analysts, interviewing them on the book, they were very cautious about distribution utility business model changes. And in general, not at all convinced that they were viable. And this is worrisome because distribution utilities are still the core of the system. They're where the customers intersect with the rest of the grid. And these analysts were still unconvinced that distribution utilities could, would, or should be able to change their business models. So that's a real interesting and worrisome choke point that I did not expect, Lawrence.
Mm-hmm. You know, that's interesting, Peter, because I think the notion here of change is one that I think we're going to be wrestling with going forward in the context of where we are with this global pandemic. And I want to spend a few minutes on that because I think there's a lot of discussion now. I would say one of the most used word today is reimagining the new normal. A lot of discussions about this reimagination of what the future is going to look like. So before reimagine, what are your thoughts on what has surprised you about how the industry has responded to COVID-19 more globally in terms of just overall response, both from a keeping the lights on perspective, but just in terms of how the system have functioned? What are your thoughts? What has surprised you the most?
First of all, I think the industry has responded very well. And big picture, Lawrence, I must say, in contrast to your question, I expected the industry to come through because it's amongst almost all industries out there. The electric power industry, all of us in it know, realizes that failure is not an option and that we're a 24/7 essential industry, the most essential of the 19 essential infrastructures. So we have pandemic plans and we have emergency plans and we triggered them and they almost entirely worked in spite of shifts in load patterns and the difficulties in getting staffs in. So I expected the industry to plan and be ready for this and to perform, and I think it did. I've heard virtually nothing worldwide about shortages of electricity or outages that couldn't be dealt with or something. And if you think about the shift in everything else we've done in our society, that's pretty remarkable. And some of the shifts in load patterns, I think we've seen shifts to residential load, of course, and lower. So what has surprised me actually, and it's somewhat reassuring, is that the momentum towards decarbonization and the clean energy future hasn't slowed as much as I feared within the electric power industry itself.
Okay.
Now, I think in cities which are really hard hit in their governments, I'm more worried about that. We're working on that at Boston University. But in the industry itself, the Energy Impact Partners, we have 19 utility partners, and they are really continuing their procurements. They're continuing their deployments. Electric vehicle sales, as some of you have noticed, have not fallen as much as conventional vehicle sales, which was remarkable in this environment. So I am surprised and encouraged that even short term, the drop off in the pace of clean energy transformation in our industry hasn't been as large as I feared it would be. Mm-hmm. It's worrisome, it's there, but it hasn't been as large, and thus I'm more reassured that the long-term trend remains intact. And I think all the information says that that's true too.
Well, I know we're coming on the hour here, but I just want to get in one or two more questions. I think one that I came up with last night, I was thinking about the book. It's sort of giving you a new title of your book, and I want you to reflect on that. And the title of your book would be—
a little late, Lawrence.
The title will be called Power After COVID-19, right? Power After COVID-19. Because COVID-19, when this is all said and done, it has upended the world. A lot is going to change. Behavioral patterns are going to change. Almost every industry is going to change. Lifestyle will change. Just huge changes across the globe. And so imagine power after COVID-19. What do you see? How do you see things evolving as our industry grapples with these massive changes in front of us over the next couple of years, more or less?
Well, first of all, as I alluded to earlier, I think the endpoint, to me, maybe I'm crazy, doesn't look that different. I think the ultimate system, both in the regulatory and political and institutional sense and in the technological sense, is going to be pretty similar. And the very large and diverse and interconnected and important toolkit of solutions is, I think, largely going to be the same. I think COVID's going to make it harder to get there in thousands of ways, large and small. I'm very, very worried about the move away from mass transit, because mass transit's a very important way to get people around cities. I'm reassured by the bicycle shortage all over the world and the closure of streets to add bikes. But with cities and mass transit systems in dire financial distress, electrifying mass transit is going to be harder as a financial and political and managerial proposition. And that's really tragic, because electrified transit is a fantastic solution and highly cost effective. So that's one example. In buildings, de-densification is going to probably increase energy footprint per person. And we're going to change outside air more often. That's going to increase heating and cooling requirements. So something as specific as that is going to move us in the wrong direction when we know that there's tremendous opportunities in continuous commissioning and tuning buildings and making them smarter.
Yeah,
so there's just thousands of things that are going to make it more challenging, Lawrence. But I think overall we stay the course and we get to where we need to get to. Otherwise, we've let one pandemic exacerbate another.
Exactly. Well, there are two quick questions here, Peter, I want to squeeze in. Very interesting. We just got it in, and I want to just hear your thoughts on it. The first one, how well are utilities prepared to incorporate EVs into the system? And then the other question is the 8% decrease in energy sales as a result of COVID. Did that translate to 8% decrease in carbon-based sources or 8% decrease from gas-fired sources? If you have the stats, you can. If you're not, I understand. But I think the first one is the grid. Are utilities ready to integrate large penetration of EVs? And then secondly, the reduction in demand, has that translated to reduction in generation from carbon-based sources or reduction in generation from natural gas or renewables?
Well, the readiness of utilities is a long discussion, because there's several dimensions of readiness. I'm sorry to not just give a yes or no, but
Sure.
Technically, yes. The difficulties are in siting, which takes a long time, and also in not knowing what charging patterns are going to look like. The ratio of fast charging to at-home charging to level 2 work charging, we're just not sure of how that's going to play out at this early stage, and thus someone has to place bets on charging infrastructure that may have low levels of utilization, and placing those financial bets now in advance of demand, because you have a chicken egg situation, that bedevils not only utilities but also the regulators who must approve those investments, and the private charging companies like Volta, one of our own EIP investments, who have to put private capital at risk. That's the thing that it's just not possible to be ready for that, and thus this uncertainty has to hang over us. Once we know where we're going to put a charger and how big it is, we can do it. It's the uncertainty of it's the making that decision. And as the carbon emissions that's declining relative to load demands, it really varies by system. In systems where there is a lot of wind and solar, most of that is must-run and non-dispatchable. Therefore, it is the natural gas and coal plants that are backed down, and emissions declines are proportionally larger than power decreases. But there are other systems in which wind and solar aren't as large a proportion of the system, and there the declines don't map as easily. You can't as easily align emissions declines and power declines.
Well, Peter, we could spend a day, a week, even a month talking about this book, a fascinating book. And I read Smart Power, and I'm trying to get it through this as much as possible. I didn't get through everything because it came out on earlier this week. But I want to end where we started. So this morning I grabbed my cup of tea, and there was a cup that had the inscription, the key to happiness is a good book. And I would say that the key to the future is a good book about electricity and a good book about the electricity sector. Here is my final question. In the beginning of the book, you have two quotes. One, from the gates of prayer, which says, "No longer can we tear the world apart to make our fire." And then two, from Thomas Edison, which says, "When you have exhausted all possibilities, remember this, you haven't." And so my question is, why did you select these two very interesting quotes that to some extent are not contradictory, but just extremely interesting? Let's end with hearing what made you choose these two quotes to set the scene for your book.
Well, thank you. My sister, who lives in Boulder, Colorado, is a bioethicist, studies religious traditions all over the world to understand how to make bioethical decisions. And she sent me that quote saying, this is not just relevant to all the religious traditions I'm looking at in the context of healthcare. Seems to me it applies to the climate imperative. And obviously one look at it, and I agreed. It's a beautiful quote from a beautiful prayer book. And it just simply talks about the fact that it is our moral and ethical imperative as humans, as a species, to respond to the challenge of climate change and cut our carbon emissions. The second quote really is from the guy who started our industry. And it really was, in a sense, an answer to the folks who say, technologically, we're not ready. I think Thomas Edison would say, yeah, we're not ready at this moment, but look at the work we're putting into this. We will find a way. And humans are tremendously inventive. We are good good tool builders. I think we will be ready by the time we need to be ready. And so we need to get going now.
Well, again, as always, Peter, I've been following you throughout my career. I have enjoyed reading your book. I've enjoyed reading your work, and I'm happy to be affiliated with you at the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. I think you've, again, delivered something that the industry would benefit from immensely. And I'd like to thank everyone who took the time from your business schedule at home or quarantine, wherever you are, to listen in on this webinar. The recording will be made available for those who would like to listen to it again. Again, Peter's book is available now online for purchase. And I think we want to wrap up here by actually giving you, Peter, the final word. And what last parting words would you give to the audience as they now will rush out there, buy your book, and spend the rest of the summer reading it? What would you like to say to them before we say goodbye?
My final word is thank you very much, Lawrence. To all of you in the audience, don't spend the rest of your summers rushing out to buy the book and reading it. Spend the rest of the summers staying safe, staying healthy, taking care of your loved ones, thanking and taking care of all the caregivers out there, the essential workers who are taking care of us, and then spending the rest of the time with me and my colleagues at Energy Impact Partners and BU and Brattle Group, decarbonizing the world's energy systems. We can do it, and I look forward to working with you to do that. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Peter, for this presentation. Thank you again. Congratulations on the book. And with that, I will say goodbye and hand it over to Daniel Knoll with EI International Program, who will give you any last-minute information regarding how you can access the information from today's webinar. Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Lawrence. Well, we'll be sending out a recording of this and a copy of the slides to everybody that registered later today. And if you are interested in hearing about future webinars and you're not already signed up to receive our newsletter, then you can reply back to me and we'll make sure we get you added to that list. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Congratulations again.